So thank you all very much for coming today to join us at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. We're very pleased today to have Philippe Benoit with us from the International Energy Agency to present on their recent released Energy Efficiency Market Report. Before we get to what we hope will be a very engaging presentation and question and answer session, just wanted to mention a few things about the center. First, we have some additional upcoming events in the next week. On October 20th, we have a discussion of MIT's Future of Solar Energy study with Frank O'Sullivan and Varun Sivaram. On October 23rd in the morning at 9:30, we have a conversation with the co-authors of IEA's 2015 Renewable Energy Market Report. It's Michael Waldron and Jaime Behar. And on August 26th, we have a conversation with Jim Rogers, who's the former CEO of Duke Energy, who has a new book out called Lighting the World, which focuses on sustainable energy access for all. And again, my name is Keith Benes. I'm a non-resident fellow here on the Center on Global Energy Policy. As I mentioned, we have Philippe Benoit here to join us today. Philippe is the head of Energy Efficiency and Environment Division of the International Energy Agency in Paris. The division is responsible for analyzing an array of energy efficiency-related issues, including the contribution of energy efficiency to global energy demand, the role of energy efficiency in climate mitigation, and other multiple benefits of energy efficiency. And prior to joining the EIA, Mr. Benoit was at the World Bank, most recently as Energy Sector Manager for Latin America and the Caribbean region. And Mr. Benoit has also worked at SG Investment Bank as Director in the Oil and Gas Division, as well as on Wall Street and energy project financings. He holds a BA in Economics and Political Science from Yale University and a JD from Harvard Law School. And again, for those joining us online, and for those of you who may not be able to join us at other events, we do stream all these events on the CGEP website, and you can ask questions of our presenter via Twitter. Just use the hashtag CGEP events and tweet at Columbia U Energy with the questions. And again, Mr. Benoit is presenting for us on energy efficiency. This is an amazingly important topic for a variety of reasons that he will explain to us. It also, unfortunately, has a reputation of being a less interesting or a less sexy topic than some of the other energy topics that we deal with here at the center, that one deals with internationally. You talk about climate change and people are focused on solar energy and on other development of renewables. They often forget the importance that energy efficiency has played and will play in climate mitigation strategies. And as Mr. Benoit will explain to us, the potential gains at net economic benefit are substantial. And without further ado, I'll introduce Mr. Benoit. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith, for those words. Thank you, Kay, for organizing this presentation. So I think, as Keith pointed out, we do have an issue when we talk about energy efficiency. So in fact, I'm going to talk about some other things first. As you may know, the International Energy Agency was formed in the mid-70s in response to the oil embargo from the OPEC countries. And oil really is a very fascinating subject. For example, we have recently seen a dramatic drop in the price of oil, and that has had knock-on effects in terms of the price of gas in Asian markets, less of an impact on European markets, but also very little impact in terms of US markets because of the whole issue of shale oil and shale gas. And I'm sure a number of you would probably be very interested in having that discussion. We'll have another presentation on that next week. Unfortunately, we're not going to be talking about that today. But another critical issue that we face from the energy side is the whole issue about energy access and energy poverty. As you know, there are over 1 billion people without access to energy, most of whom live in sub-Saharan Africa. And there is, in sub-Saharan Africa, a site at Inga, which is a hydropower site which has the ability to generate about 45 megawatts of capacity from this single site, enough to power New York City 3 times, enough in and of itself to overcome the access challenge that we see in Africa. A very, very, very important issue. But I won't be talking to you about that today. Rather, I'm going to talk to you about electric motors. Yep. Or the little engine that could. Well, why is it one reason that we actually spend a lot of time at the IEA talking about electric motors? So put this in the context of the climate discussions. As you know, in Paris in December, the world will be getting together to see if they can come to an agreement on how to avoid climate change. And energy is an integral part of that issue, in part because what you see here is that the energy sector produces about 66% of the greenhouse gas emissions. And if we look into the future, and if we look at the challenge of trying to have an emissions path that's consistent with limiting global temperature increases to less than 2 degrees, energy sector and decarbonization of the energy sector is center to that effort. Now at the IEA, what we do is we try to analyze ways in which we can effectively, in a cost-effective manner, decarbonize the electricity sector and the energy sector. Basically move from a situation where we have this type of emissions path that you see here in red, which is consistent with a world in which we would see about a 6-degree increase in temperature, to one that matches the green line, fundamentally something that's consistent with 2 degrees. And the big point here is how do we get from the red line down to the green line. And what we do at the IEA is we basically analyze different technologies to figure out how we can cost effectively do that. And there are fundamentally 6 key technologies that we look at. Nuclear, renewables is obviously a big part of the story. But what is interesting is that in the IEA analysis, when we try to predict and project and model what is the most cost-effective way to reduce emissions to get to a level consistent with limiting global temperature increase to 2 degrees, energy efficiency is the largest contributor to that decarbonization. Energy efficiency provides 40% of the decarbonization. It's 40% of the solution to getting us to 2 degrees. And in fact, the previous slide showed actions through 2050. Even if we look at actions over the next 5 years or so, what we see is that energy efficiency provides an even bigger share of what we need to do in terms of decarbonizing. A couple of years ago, what we did is we looked in terms of the short term, what would actions that we could take in the energy sector in a cost-effective manner to start to bend the emissions curve. And energy efficiency provided 50% of that decarbonization. And when we break that down, what we see a lot of heating, cooling, and again, those industrial motors. Basically, increasing the efficiency of industrial motors in a cost-effective manner, something that's relatively easy to do, provides a big impact in terms of reducing emissions, even in the short term. So energy efficiency is a big part of the solution. Now, energy efficiency is also helpful not simply in terms of decarbonization, but also in terms of promoting economic growth. A couple of years ago at the IEA, we projected, we analyzed what would the world look like if we took advantage of all the economically profitable energy efficiency opportunities that are out there. And what we see is significant upward movement in terms of GDP. So energy efficiency, not only is it critical and helpful in terms of decarbonization, but fundamentally has a pro-growth impact in a variety of very key countries. Having said that, coming back to this whole issue of 40% decarbonization, this will require significant investment. At the IEA, we look at the current policies that exist in the world, and we basically try to project what will be the amount of investments that that current policy environment will provide. And what you see here in the green box is that current policies, we believe, will lead to about $8 trillion worth of investments in energy efficiency. Today, people buy more efficient lighting, people buy more efficient cars, insulation in buildings improving, and that will continue over time. And we basically project that current policies will lead to investments in energy efficiency of $8 trillion over the next 22 years. The issue is that that is not sufficient to get us to the 2-degree pathway. In fact, our analysis shows that in order for us to get to that bending of the curve, to that 2-degree pathway, we would need to be investing $14 trillion, an additional $6 trillion in energy efficiency. Now, the other thing that's kind of interesting when you look at this bar graph, if you compare the top to the bottom, is that when it comes to fossil fuel power generation versus renewables, fundamentally, the total amount of investment, whether it's a high-degree case or low-degree case, remains largely the same. What you fundamentally see in that area is a shifting of investment patterns from fossil fuels to renewables of about $4 trillion. But when it comes to energy efficiency, we're not looking at a shifting. What we really need is a significant increase in the total amount of investment that's being made in energy efficiency. Now, the good news is that we believe that there's a significant untapped potential in economically profitable energy efficiency investments. In other words, we can, in fact, spend a lot more in energy efficiency on projects that will generate returns. And what we did was we analyzed what we saw as the projected investment patterns in energy efficiency consistent with it $8 trillion, and we compared that to the potential to actually invest in profitable energy efficiency investments. And interestingly enough, our analysis shows that for every dollar that we will be investing in energy efficiency, there are another $2 that we could also invest in economically profitable energy efficiency investments. So there's a big need to increase the amount of investments, and there's also a significant untapped potential to do so. So in that regard, what we at the IEA have done is we've prepared a series of reports that analyzes what, in fact, does the energy efficiency market look like. This is a rare physical copy because we're not actually producing physical copies of this. And where's Kay? I wanted to give it to her, but I'll leave it for her. I'll give it to you. But I will say that it is available for free on download at our site, and I encourage all of you to do it so that we can know that there's actually interest in this area. So that's the little marketing pitch in that regard. So, talking about the market, what does the market actually look like? It's basically bigger than you might think. We estimate that the energy efficiency market is worth on an annual basis about $300 billion. That is actually larger than investments in power generation in renewables. So next week, my colleagues will come and talk to you about the renewables market report that was just launched. The estimate there is that globally we spend about $260 billion a year in renewables power generation. We actually estimate that we spend even more than that in energy efficiency. We spend more than we actually spend in terms of fossil fuel power generation. But having said that, we spend a lot less than the amount of investments in upstream gas, coal, and oil, which is the last column. So a significant amount of investments that are being made. Now, one of the issues that we face in terms of energy efficiency and trying to explain and convince people that it's important is that fundamentally when we compare what happens in terms of energy efficiency to other fossil fuels, we're not looking at a level playing field. And let me give you an illustration why. This light that you see here is being powered in part by power plants that were built 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, even 30 or 40 years ago. But when we think about energy efficiency, what tends to happen is the following. We'll come out with an energy efficiency policy, so for example, to improve fuel economy standards or to improve the efficiencies of certain appliances or some of those industrial motors. We'll adopt that in 1999. It'll generate some savings. The energy efficiency experts will look at that. The policy experts will look at it. And then everybody will forget about it. But the fact of the matter is, when we improve the insulation in buildings, every single year, year after year after year, that insulation will generate energy savings. Just like we get a kilowatt hour out of a renewables plant that was built 20 years ago, hydropower plants and the like, we similarly get the savings from energy efficiency. You can either put PV solar panels on your roof, or you can put insulation in your roof. You put PV panels on your roof, what's going to tend to happen is somebody out there is going to be measuring how many kilowatt hours did I get, is it doing great or not? People put this on the internet. You put insulation in your roof, all of a sudden you need less electricity to heat your home or to air condition your home. But nobody pays attention to the fact that you're getting this ongoing savings from energy efficiency. Now you might say, so what? Well, the fact of the matter is, from our perspective, this has an impact on the lack of attention that energy efficiency gets. And fundamentally, a failure to recognize that energy efficiency represents a major part of our energy landscape. How big a part? So what we did is we tried to analyze what the world would look like if we hadn't been making energy efficiency investments. What you have here is total final consumption from a set of the largest IEA economies. And what you see, total final consumption basically means how much are households, businesses, governments consuming in terms of electricity for heating, lighting, and the like. And interestingly enough, from 1973 through 2011, you get a relatively flat curve. What we did was we calculated what were the savings from energy efficiency investments that were made from 1973 onwards. Again, bearing in mind that if you put insulation in a building in 2000, you're going to have benefits for the next 10 years. If in 2002 you come in and you increase the standards and you build another building next to it, that is going to provide savings that are in addition to the original set of savings. And basically, you end up with this type of diagram. The green represents the impact of energy efficiency investments that were made since 1973. And the critical point here, I'd like to draw your attention to the last column. What you see in the last column is that the amount of savings from energy efficiency investments over the last 4 decades was larger than the contribution of any single fuel to total final consumption. The amount of savings was larger than the amount of oil that we consumed in our cars. It was larger than the amount of electricity we consumed. It was larger than the amount of gas that was used for heating and the like. Basically, energy efficiency is, from our perspective, the first fuel. Now, some people refer to energy efficiency as the first fuel from more of a normative perspective. It's the first fuel because it's clean. It's the first fuel because it's cheap. We were saying it's the first fuel because it's the biggest fuel. In fact, put another way, looking at these figures, what you see is the contribution, the savings from energy efficiency was larger than the contribution of any single fuel to total final consumption. So not only are we spending a lot of money in energy efficiency, we're also getting a lot of output from energy efficiency. Now, one thing that we try to do is to try to understand and distinguish the impact of energy efficiency on total final consumption from other factors. And what you have in blue, looking at a series of IEA countries starting with 1990, is what total final consumption would have looked like in these IEA countries. Okay, it's for you. What it would look like in these countries as a result of economic activity and population growth. Basically, as the economy grows, people consume more energy. Put it another way, people consume more energy to grow the economy. So, not surprisingly, if you look around 2007 to 2009, what you see is a dip in what would have been total final consumption consistent with a recession. In fact, that is now what total final consumption was. Total final consumption was the line in blue. And what you see it peaking around 2004 and coming down. Just to explain this chart, it's basically indexed. 100% were the certain values, and over time you see the changes relative to those values. So we actually see a situation where total final consumption did not track what happened in terms of economic activity and increases in population. Why is that? 2 major factors. The first is total final consumption energy use as it relates to economic activity is driven in part by the structure of our economies. The more business, more of GDP that comes from energy-intensive businesses such as manufacturing as compared to services, you're going to have a relatively higher amount of total final consumption. As you tend to shift from energy-intensive businesses like steel production to service businesses like selling insurance policies, you tend to see a reduction in total final consumption. So there's a natural tendency for changes in the structure of the economy to change what happens in terms of total final consumption. From our perspective, that's not energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is making our equipment and our systems more efficient. Interestingly enough, this is what total final consumption in green would have looked like simply as a result of energy efficiency. And the big point here is 2/3 of the downward pressure, right? 2/3 of the things that are drawing the blue line down to the brown line is the result of energy efficiency. So energy efficiency is the major factor that has been dampening, slowing the increase in total final consumption while GDP has continued to grow, fundamentally enabling us to decouple GDP growth from energy consumption, and I'm going to come back to this point. But some of the analysis that then follows really focuses in on, okay, what does this actually translate into, the fact that we have this impact in terms of energy efficiency? So what we've tried to do, in part through the market process, this market report process and other things, is start to make this a little realer, a little more tangible for people. So the first thing is we converted that change in total final consumption into what does it actually represent in terms of savings. Now, in fact, just from a language perspective, what we tend to find is people who are very pro-growth oriented don't really like to talk about savings. They like to talk about producing things. You produce kilowatt hours, you produce barrels of oil, you produce gas, you make the economy run, you make it run bigger. And so what we've tried to do is not so much talk about savings, but rather talk about avoided consumption. Energy efficiency investments produce not a barrel of oil, not a cubic meter of gas, but it produces avoided consumption. And what you have here is the amount of avoided consumption generated from investment since 1990. Now, the reason it tends to increase is because every year you have increasing energy efficiency investments, which are added on to other things. Goes back to my earlier point about energy efficiency keeps producing. And when you get here to 2013, 2014, what you see is that energy efficiency has basically produced in avoided consumption 22 exajoules. Now, who here knows what a joule is? Raise your hand. Very good. I really don't know what a joule is. I actually come from the supply side. I know what a barrel of oil is. A lot of time we talk in terms of millions of ton of oil equivalent. Who knows what that is? A few of the same people. So a ton of oil equivalent is basically a cubic meter of oil. But even then, we struggle. We always struggle on the energy efficiency side. The big point here, so let's just talk in relative terms. Those 22 exajoules are more than what Korea and Japan consumed last year together. So big savings from 25 years worth of investments in energy efficiency. Now, what is one of the reasons that we actually are so concerned about trying to make this a little more tangible? It's because we really run into this issue where there's always a tendency to want to talk about supply side responses. And what you see here is an interesting analysis that the IEA did a couple of years ago that talked about what is the projected evolution of the energy system in the United States. And one of the conclusions of that was that we projected that by the middle of the next decade, the United States, some people would say, would become energy independent. It was really more that it would start becoming a net exporter of energy. A big reason for that was because there was a projected drop in the amount of imports of barrels of oil. And that's what this graph, the bottom line, shows. And all of this discussion, or virtually all of the discussion around that point, at that time, 2 or 3 years ago, and today, continues to be around this issue of domestic production. American domestic production of tight oil, shale gas, producing oil and gas. The fact of the matter is, in our analysis, a significant portion of the reduction in the demand for oil imports came from improving fuel economy standards. In fact, if you look at 2025, 40% of the reduction in the need for fuel imports comes from CAFE standards, the fuel economy standards. Energy efficiency was a big part of the energy independence story within the United States, but it gets very, very little play. And this has implications, and it also has a variety of reasons for it. What you have here is a description of the energy constellation of supplies that feed into total final consumption. If you open any IEA document or you go to the US website or of any other country, what you'll see is total final consumption broken down by its constituent elements. So you have a lot of oil in the US, natural gas, electricity. What you don't see is that green part. But it's clear that that green part is having a big impact on how much oil the United States is importing. Or to put it another way, when it comes to impact, there is no difference in impact between what you produce and you put in your car to enable you to drive 100 kilometers and what you don't need to produce to put in your car to drive the 100 kilometers because the efficiency of the car has improved. But this is what the world tends to look like in terms of our measurements. And fundamentally, when you add in the energy savings, for example, since 1990, this larger pie, including energy savings, really gives you a better sense as to what's going on in terms of meeting energy service demand. Let's take this room. You have efficient lighting. We're all satisfied with the lighting. The air conditioning is working well. Some of that is being generated by electricity, kilowatts that are being consumed. Some of that is being generated by energy efficiency improvements. If we project 10 years into the future, we'll have the same level of comfort. We'll be consuming even less electricity. Why? Because we would have had energy efficiency improvements. The green part gives a fuller vision as to what's really going on in terms of energy service demand. The level of comfort we have here, which reflects energy efficiency investments, is the larger pie, not the smaller pie. So now you see it, now you don't, and this is what people see. And when they look at this and they have discussions in governments, they talk about oil, natural gas. When they're talking about energy security, they talk about this. Nobody talks about energy savings except for the energy efficiency specialists. And that conversation gets a little boring. So what's true in the US is true in so many places. So fact of the matter is all of these countries are basically producing energy efficiency. Now part of the challenge we have is often to try to convey what are we actually talking about? What are easy ways to sort of illustrate this point? Well, one thing is always to talk about money. So nobody knows what, or a few of you know what exajoules are in million tons of oil equivalent, but we all understand dollars. And what you have here is that physical component converted into dollars. And what you see is that basically by the time you get to 2012, 2013, 2014, 20 years, 25 years of investments are generating $500 billion of savings. Cumulative over that period, $5.7 trillion. On an annual basis, the $500 billion of savings within the IEA is larger than what the European Union spends on fuel imports every single year. So massive physical impact, massive financial impact. And in fact, as I'll come back to this a little later, has a definite impact on trade balances. Now, when we think about energy efficiency, one of the issues to think about is also the fact that the production that we're getting, the savings that we're getting, is basically domestic. It doesn't require any import. So if we think about it in terms of the gasoline and the car, you buy the car, it's sitting there in your driveway, you drive it to your relatives, you drive 300 kilometers, 300 miles to your relatives. You use less gasoline because of energy efficiency. That energy efficiency was basically produced in the United States. When this lighting is working and it's more efficient, there's basically a hidden motor in there that's producing another set of lighting, also domestic. So it's important to sort of recognize that not only is there a physical production that's taking place, that physical production is domestic. We're not importing any oil to generate that savings. We're not importing any gas. This also is another major attribute of energy efficiency. And so what we did at the IEA is we tried to analyze what, in fact, is the positive impact on imports that energy efficiency investments are having. And what we did was we basically took the physical amount of savings, we applied that to each country's import share, how much of their energy consumption was being generated by imports, and then we allocated that across different fuels. And so what you have here for the largest IEA countries is the savings in coal, the savings in oil, and the savings in natural gas, all of which translates into a lot of money. Basically, we estimate that the amount of savings from energy efficiency investments since 1990, the amount of savings that generated in 2014 in terms of avoided imports only is $80 billion. Now, one thing that you see here is much larger in Germany than it is in the United States, and that reflects the fact that Germany relies much more on imports. But also has very significant benefits in terms of trade balances. We estimate that this amount of savings, the amount of money that Germany did not have to spend on imports, improved their trade balance by about 11–12%. Or if we think about Japan, Japan recently has become a net importer, in part because the Fukushima crisis has led to them moving to fossil fuel generation, all of which has to be imported. So in Japan, it decreased their trade deficit. Germany improved their surplus, Japan decreased their deficit. But it's also security for other countries. As you all know, Ukraine is facing a variety of challenges, in part given its relationship with Russia and the uncertainty of gas imports. And what Ukraine is now doing is Ukraine is looking to energy efficiency, opportunities to improve efficiency in buildings and like, to basically reduce the need for imports, to enhance their security in the short to medium term. So a big part of the solution there. And then when we talk about climate change. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, we project 40% of the abatement needs to come from energy efficiency going forward. But we've also had energy efficiency impacts in the past. And what we see is that basically investments since 1990 have helped to reduce the amount of emissions that we have seen, making the amount of global emissions in the air less, and as a result, really making the path to Paris and to the 2-degree objective easier. So a very significant positive impact in terms of greenhouse gases. Now, all this about low oil prices. What we sort of see is that the impact on energy efficiency is fundamentally mixed. What you see in the United States, in the blue line are gasoline prices, red line is the average fuel efficiency of cars that are actually being sold. And what you see as the blue line has dropped precipitously here, you've seen a slight flattening, in fact a slight deterioration in terms of the fuel economy standards of cars that are being sold, because in America people are tending to buy more SUVs. Having said that, the fuel economy standards are expected to increase, and so we believe that that policy will continue to provide a driver for further energy efficiency investments. In fact, worldwide, we believe that we see a lot of policy drivers that will continue to push an expansion of the energy efficiency market, notwithstanding low oil prices in large part because of things like the Energy Efficiency Directive in the European Union or even the U.S. attempts on the Clean Power Act. So fundamentally, policy drivers, we believe, will continue to push energy efficiency. Having said that, if the price of oil remains low for a long period of time, we would expect to see a weakening of that type of support. We looked at a variety of key sectors. One area we looked at was the building sector. We estimate that there are about $100 billion, $90 billion or so being spent on energy efficiency in buildings, led by the United States, China, and Germany. That's a big amount of money. We project it will increase to $120 billion by 2020, but having said that, that's actually not sufficient to get us to the decarbonization. We need more pushes in terms of investments in energy efficiency in buildings to get us to where we need in terms of decarbonization. The other thing we looked at in the report is the impact of energy efficiency on electricity supply. What we have seen over the last several decades is every year the growth in electricity supply and demand has been diminishing. Since 2011 in OECD countries, it's gone negative. Energy efficiency is a big part of that story. What you see here in the green bar are the amount of savings. That is having an impact on a variety of utilities who no longer have the opportunities to make money from new power plants. They, in fact, are starting to look at energy efficiency. It's also had a positive impact in terms of renewables targets, because basically, as the overall amount of demand is less, you actually need fewer amounts of gigawatts to meet any share production target that you might have. We look across a variety of countries. It's very interesting to see that energy efficiency is becoming more popular, not simply with importing countries, but with exporting countries. Subnationals is not only a government issue. Cities like Tokyo, Seoul, and the like are doing a lot to promote it, and it's a phenomenon that we're seeing everywhere. Interestingly enough, when you look at Latin America's two largest economies, they often use energy efficiency not just for savings, but also to promote poverty goals to basically deal with fuel poverty among poorer populations. So to give you some examples, Saudi Arabia is facing a massive critical increase in domestic consumption driven by air conditioners and cars. And what you see here, when you compare 2000 to 2013, is that the amount of production that needs to go to meet domestic demands has increased from 20% to 32%. Saudi Arabia is looking to control this, contain this. So, for example, they've adopted a policy to improve the efficiency of air conditioners by 35%, which we estimate will free up an additional 47 million barrels of production to be sold with basically a street value of about $2.4 billion. Interesting case in Seoul, where basically, arguably maybe following on the Fukushima event, there was a movement to try to avoid having to build another power plant. They're doing that through energy efficiency, and basically what you see in Seoul is the use of small LED lights, put a lot of them together, and you can have the type of impact that allows you to avoid having to build another big power plant. And Massachusetts, just because we're in the US, they're a major leader in doing energy efficiency. So just some final thoughts that relate to this issue that are interesting to bear in mind. The first is coming back to the initial point. The INDCs have come in. It's very fascinating, really. Most of the world, over 140 countries, have submitted INDCs. And at the IEA, we basically modeled what would the emissions path look like if countries were to implement their INDCs. And what you see here is a flat plateauing of emissions out of the energy sector. The problem is we need to get much deeper. And as a result, you can expect there's going to be significant room for increased push for energy efficiency stimulus packages over the coming 10 to 15 years. Second thing is that energy efficiency provides not only benefits in terms of greenhouse gases or energy security, but also a whole stream of benefits which we feel are important to push. So, for example, the whole issue of air pollution. What you have here that you can't really see is smog. And actually, I normally say this is smog in Beijing, and you look at it and people say, isn't that Paris? This is actually smog in Paris, but you can't see it. What's interesting is that the French government, faced with a series of smog events over the last 2 years, made the subway for free. That encourages people to move from cars to subways. That's a more efficient form of transport. So what we see is energy efficiency being used to fight air pollution. Another major point, when we look at decarbonization, this is the same wedge I showed at the beginning, not by technology, but by geographic location. 70% of the decarbonization needs to take place under our estimates in non-OECD countries. That's very much a reflection of the fact that most of the demand in energy we project will come from non-OECD countries. More than 90% as those economies grow and the populations grow. Critical issue. When we think about that, we often talk about energy intensity, which kind of is a negative concept. We need to think about energy productivity, how you can get as much GDP out of every unit of energy that you use. We often think about doing more with less. Well, in poorer countries, they don't think about doing more with less. They want to do even more with more. We need to sort of shift and recognize that fundamentally the role of energy efficiency in most of the world is increasing standards of living and promoting prosperity, not generating energy savings. Their consumption might actually go up. In fact, what you have here is historical GDP, anticipated growth in GDP. What you have in the blue line is what's happened with energy demand. What you have in the red line is where we would go under a business as usual case. What we want to do is get to the point where we see more efficient use, but still fundamentally you have an increase in energy consumption. Think about China. China today consumes about 3,000 million tons of oil equivalent. They want to double or triple their income per capita. If they continue at the rate they're going now, they would be consuming 6,000, 9,000 million tons of oil equivalent. It's a daunting challenge. It would represent about 60% of what the world consumes. The Chinese are very sensitive to this, and so they're very much concerned about how they can bend the curve, and they look very much to energy efficiency to do that. And then what's also interesting is what's going on in Europe. In Europe, there's a program to reduce energy consumption by about 20% in a business as usual compared to a business as usual scenario. But what's striking isn't so much the big drop, but rather that they're looking to reduce it in absolute terms. In fact, it's very interesting. We need to start thinking about not only what's happening on the supply side, but on the demand side. Because this tendency, we're seeing this in a variety of other countries. In the United States, in Japan, in Europe, there are discussions about dropping, limiting, capping, in some ways, overall energy demand. In fact, we see a variety of policies in that regard. For example, Germany has a policy to diminish by 50% energy consumption in absolute terms. And obviously, we have the whole issue about how that's consistent with the 2-degree world. So, the last point I just wanted to say is that when we think about the whole issue about climate change, and we have to sit there and think about the future that we want, are we going to be looking at a 2-degree world, or are we going to be looking at a 4-degree world? The answer to that really lies in that little engine. It's the little engine that can beat climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip, for that amazing presentation. I have pages of notes and questions here that I won't bog us all down with, because we will want to move to questions from the audience and to anyone who may submit them via Twitter. Again, my name is Keith Benes, a non-resident fellow here at the Center on Global Energy Policy with Philippe Benoit from the IEA, talking about the Energy Efficiency Market Report. For those of us joining us online, you can tweet your questions using the hashtag CGEP events and tweet to @ColumbiaUEnergy. And of course, our website where you can find the podcast of this event and live streaming of our future events is at energypolicy.columbia.edu. And so with that, for people that want to ask questions of Philip, we will move to an audience Q&A in about 10 or 15 minutes, but I thought we could just have a bit of a discussion first. And I think that one thing I might do is first exercise a sort of moderator prerogative to disagree with you slightly about one point, or see if we disagree. And that is when you were talking about you had the graph of the U.S. decline in oil imports. And you were making the point that from the perspective of, putting the fueling your automobile to move 100 kilometers, whether it's the fuel is what you're actually putting into it or the efficiency gains to get it 100 kilometers, there's no difference. And I actually think there could potentially be one difference where you're understating the benefits of energy efficiency gains, actually, and that is, so say you take the example of the United States, where, as you mentioned, we've had the discussion that's all been focused on reducing oil imports because of increased domestic production. And actually a big part of the issue is reduced consumption, also driven largely by CAFE standards, that where you shift it to just, you reduce imports that are just because of increased domestic production. If you have an oil price spike, your money stays within your economy, but it still shifts from other sectors into the oil and gas sector. Whereas if you make that savings and you reduce imports because of energy efficiency gains, the money does not go to be exported to import that oil. It also doesn't shift over to that energy sector. And I was wondering if that's, I guess maybe I see you nodding, so I guess maybe you agree with that point, sort of. So we can just move on from there.
I can go like that.
Exactly. No, but it is when one thinks about the energy security benefits, it is not just the decrease in, it's a domestic fuel that not only decreases your import reliance, but it also decreases your reliance on fossil fuels or on that sort of shift of funds into the energy sector when there's a price spike in commodity prices.
Right. Yeah, I agree totally. So part of the issue is, if you look at my title, it says Energy Efficiency Division. So I think people feel that I have a bias that I come in with. So to a certain extent, I'll note some of the benefits and probably really sometimes really understate them. I agree totally with your point, and I think something you touched upon at the very end is important, which is the whole issue about price volatility. Clearly, we don't face the same type of price volatility when you've generated savings through energy efficiency as opposed to when you have to go to the gasoline pump. And if I could just use that to sort of segue into a related point on the issue of data. I cannot overstate the importance of trying to generate data. And unfortunately, a lot of the analysis in energy efficiency is dependent on having quality data. But in that regard, it was interesting. I did a presentation yesterday in Washington, and somebody made the comment. They said, well, part of the problem we have with energy efficiency is that it's not always easy to actually assess what is the extent of the impact. And I said, well, that's an interesting comment. That's true. So you have a lack of precision when it comes to energy efficiency. But in fact, when you look at energy efficiency and you're trying to figure out the output, you don't have the same amount of volatility that you see in the oil sector and the gas sector. So fundamentally, you may not be able to specify so clearly what the price is, but the variability you have in the price or that value is much less volatile than what you see in a lot of supply side investments.
Interesting. So that's I will take that on board, as I was working on a couple of projects, and I will take that into consideration. I want to follow up with you about that. I have a couple of additional questions that go from the fairly specific to a bit more general. And the first one is about the building sector, and you did a deeper dive into it here. And it's one of the most, my understanding, has one of the biggest potential gains in terms of avoided consumption at net economic benefit. You mentioned that we're at something like $90 billion investing in energy efficiency in the building sector now, to 120 billion by 2020, but that we need to get to 215 billion to get to the 2DS scenario. And my question is that 215 billion, would that still be investments that are net economic benefit, that is the avoided fuel costs outweigh the expenditure on the energy efficiency? And is that before or after you take account of sort of externalities like local air pollution or climate change when you do those calculations?
So, I mean, thanks for that. That's an important question. The 215 billion fall within the realm, within the universe of projects that are still economically profitable. What we estimate that basically when you look at the building sector in particular, I think that we estimate that only about 1 in 5 of the investments in buildings that are economically profitable will take place under current policies and practices. And let me stress the practices. I mean, the big issue that we often see in buildings in, for example, OECD countries, is that 80% of the buildings that will exist in 2050 exist today. And so that means what we really need to do to improve the efficiency of those buildings are renovations. And there seems to be a real hesitancy for people to want to undertake a deep renovation of their building. So even though it's economically profitable, we find that there's a significant lack of interest. And that's why I would say innovation actually becomes very, very important. A lot of time innovation in renewables is important to drive down the price. But on the energy efficiency side, and when we think about buildings, what may be almost more important in terms of innovation is getting to the point where we can do these things in a physical manner that is not so intrusive to homeowners and commercial real estate owners.
So, so in the building sector, it may actually be the sort of not the improving technology and what you can do in terms of, say, the installation. It's the sort of amount of time out and time down to actually get them done with the renovation. Mm-hmm. Interesting. But to be clear, so when you're saying the net economic benefit, you're saying before taking account of any potential carbon price, right, before pricing in the externalities of local air pollution. Interesting. So go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to, I mean, you know, part of the issue that actually hasn't helped, I think, the energy efficiency community is we often say energy efficiency is the low-hanging fruit. Because it's actually amazing the amount of investments that you can make in energy efficiency from simply a cost-benefit analysis that will generate a positive return. At the same time, we see that there's significant underinvestment. And I think fundamentally the reality is it may be a low-hanging fruit, but we don't like that fruit.
Right.
We're interested in doing a variety of other things. There's even, to be frank, I think, a psychological issue. The fact of the matter is people are much more interested in talking about renewables than they are in talking about energy efficiency. And if I could give an illustration of that, some of these issues go beyond simply cost. Germany adopted a very aggressive feed-in tariff to promote renewables. And I think when you look at the economics of that, there was always borderline. And my own sense was fundamentally the Germans understood that. But they were willing to, it was a social compact issue. The German population at the time felt this is the right thing to do, we're going to do it. They feel that a little less now because the economy's had a negative impact. But for many, many years, they felt they were excited about doing it. The number of times that my kids have come home with some renewables-related project, all of these things have a positive impact in terms of people's willingness to take the effort of putting solar panels on their roof. Insulation, we have a big, big issue. And so, for example, in the UK, they had a project to encourage people to put insulation in their homes. What did they do? They didn't say, first they tried, hey, we'll put insulation in your homes, you'll save money. That didn't work. What they did instead was they said, we'll come out and we'll clean your attic. And while we're cleaning your attic, we'll put insulation in your house. Now, it's unclear what the returns are, but some initial indications were repositioning the product had a big impact in terms of people's willingness to do uptake.
And do you see your example of Germany and the feed-in tariff there makes me think, do you see, is there an additional tension in the economics of pursuing, policies that promote renewable deployment and policies that might promote the better energy efficiency, and thinking to the extent that a feed-in tariff might on the downside sort of put a cap on electricity prices, it creates that slight disincentive from pursuing the efficiency gains, or I guess that's the question, does it? And have you looked at countries that have successfully balanced that, pursuing renewables, pursuing energy efficiency, and getting comprehensive policies that drive it both?
Okay, let me answer that in three ways. The first is to recognize there are significant positive synergies between energy efficiency and renewables. So I alluded to it a little in the presentation when I talked about the fact that when you have energy efficiency, which has had an impact of dampening demand, that means you actually need to build fewer new gigawatts to achieve your target. That's kind of an aggregated level. But the fact of the matter is, as we think about moving to decentralized generation, if you can put solar panels on the roof and at the same time improve the insulation in the home, improve the appliances in the home, you actually get to the point where you're able to generate much more auto-sufficient buildings. So very much we see major opportunities for synergies complementary in terms of energy efficiency and renewables. Having said that, I think basically there is probably a political tension to the extent that to a certain degree there's probably a certain amount of political will to push the green agenda, and you'll probably see maybe some tensions in that regard, whether people are willing and governments are willing to push renewables issue rather than energy efficiency, just because I think as a practical matter they may have a limited amount of resources in terms of political will. But we fundamentally need to move beyond that. Now, having said that, I think everybody understands and people have analyzed that there are implications and interactions that can get a little complex. And I'll give you an illustration of that regarding the European Union and the efforts to try to revitalize the emissions trading system in the European Union. As you know, the European Union came out with a target recently of 40% for greenhouse gas emissions reduction and a renewables target of 30%. And they used to have a target on energy efficiency, and there was a thought they were going to come out with a target of 30% for energy efficiency, which is what the energy efficiency experts were pushing for. In fact, I understand there was some analysis that showed that if you ended up with a target of 30% for energy efficiency, what they would do is they would mandate a certain amount of energy efficient activities, and as a result, that would eliminate from the market the demand to actually purchase certificates, which would then lower the price that was anticipated in the market. There's a general sense in the ETS market, there's a general sense you need to have a price that's sufficiently high, 20, 30 euros a ton, to incentivize activity. And there was a sense that if you had too aggressive energy efficiency target, you would actually have an adverse impact on what the ultimate price would be in the market. So rather than going for 30%, they went for something around 27, 28%, with the agreement that they would come back and potentially revisit it. Because energy efficiency, for example, in the Ukrainian situation, provides a lot of benefits beyond simply greenhouse gas emissions reduction.
And again, I will move to audience Q&A after this question now, so if people want to begin lining up if you have those. But a two-part question that again, about this potential crossover between renewables and energy efficiency, and that is with respect to more on the technology side and the private financial side. And both of them, though, coming from the example of solar PV in the United States and the interaction that there's been with one developing the business model that I don't want to refer to any particular company, but there are several out there, some more famous than others, that have gotten to perfect the business model where they pay the capital up front, they install the solar panels at no cost to the homeowner, they capture the tax and rebates, and they capture the energy savings, and they've figured out their contracts. And that getting perfected along with the technology development on the costs coming down, the rather dramatic costs coming down, really has driven a rapid deployment on that sort of end-use solar panels. And so the question is, one, are we seeing, if there's, say, in the building sector, if there's only 1 in 20 or 1 in 5 economic projects go forward, I mean, there's potential cash flows there. Are people figuring out the financial models to capture that? And then the other one is outside of the building sector. Is there some technology? What's the next big potential technology development that might get us somewhere? Is it in industrial engines? Is it, where should we look for that?
Okay, on the issue of financing and business models, I think we see a significantly greater sophistication in the renewables market than we see in the energy efficiency market. One of the reasons is because basically you talked about solar panels. A lot of the business in renewables is going to be about solar panels or maybe mini wind turbines. So a much more limited set of activities. While when we think about energy efficiency, windows in a windows, building envelope, lighting, part of the diverse nature of the energy efficiency market and its activities, it really presents a major challenge. But we are seeing some positive evolutions in terms of providing for more sophisticated financing models, one of which is really designed to reduce the risk, the financing risk, that if you lend money to a household to install a more efficient boiler or something else, that you won't actually get repaid, and that is through the whole on-bill financing system, where you basically have, for example, utilities that will help to provide households with an improved good, and then will actually get repaid through their utility bills. Most people tend to pay their electricity bills, and that is something, for example, that has been used very successfully in Mexico, as well as in other countries. In the United States, there's the PACE program, which is the same type of system, and it relies on the fact it uses as the channel payment of real estate taxes. So we are seeing a variety of innovations in the energy efficiency financing market. Our sense is energy efficiency is moving from less of a niche product, moving into the mainstream, but it has a lot further to go. In terms of technological innovations, there are probably some important opportunities out there that in some ways may have to do more, as I said, with the delivery issue. I mean, renovation of buildings is a major untapped area in terms of promoting more efficient activity, and I think that's a combination in some ways, maybe of some technological breakthroughs, but also some improvements in delivery mechanisms. But it's also important to recognize when we talk about fuel economy standards, the fact of the matter is that technology is way ahead of where we are in terms of standards. So what's lacking in some areas regarding energy efficiency is really political will and motivation.
And with that, we'll move to some audience questions. Again, this is Keith Benes with Philippe Benoit at the Center on Global Energy Policy, talking about the International Energy Agency's Energy Efficiency Market Report. And as you ask your questions, please state your name, any affiliation you have, and then the questions that you have for Mr. Benoit.
Thank you very much. Cesar Penafiel, student here at SIPA. Thank you very much for the very energetic presentation. As a energy student here, I can tell you that you're right. Energy efficiency is not that sexy even for students. I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate. I don't think anybody denies the role of energy efficiency, because at the very least you are increasing energy services, and as you alluded to that in the developing world. But some people, and friends of mine at the Breakthrough Institute, question the role of energy efficiency when it comes to climate change because of the rebound effect. And I haven't heard that you mentioning that. So can you talk about that, and how does the rebound effect affect your modeling in the 2-degree scenario? Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that question. So a few responses. First of all, in terms of our modeling, our basic model assumes a rebound effect, I think in the order of about 10%. So just to explain, the rebound effect is basically that as you become more efficient, it actually encourages people maybe to use that product a little more. That's the direct rebound effect. Your cars are more efficient, you drive further. Another one is an income effect. You're spending less money on X, you have more money to spend, so you spend it on other things where there's energy consumption. Let me just spend a little time on that second point, because I think it's important to recognize that while some people love to talk about the issue of rebound effect as a negative issue, fundamentally, when we're thinking about emerging economies and developing countries, and that's something we think about a lot, the fact of the matter is energy efficiency increases the amount of disposable income to spend on other things other than energy consumption. And the fact that poor people or middle-class people go out and spend that on some goods which may involve some energy consumption, we don't view that as a negative impact. We view that as part of trying to promote development. Third thing I just want to say very quickly is you said nobody denies the role of energy efficiency. You said something like that. Let me tell you, my experience is a lot of people actually deny the positive role of energy efficiency. In particular, it comes back to a point I mentioned earlier. A lot of people, including in emerging economies, view energy efficiency as anti-growth. The obsession on savings as opposed to increasing productivity has, to a certain extent, given energy efficiency a bad name. And I can tell you that's all the more so in the context of climate negotiations, where if everybody goes out there and says energy efficiency is the key to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, reducing greenhouse gas emissions is sometimes interpreted as, oh, well, basically, you, the OECD world, have developed, you've emitted all these greenhouse gases, now there isn't enough room for us to do it, now you want to constrain our growth through energy efficiency. So we have a big issue in terms of trying to stress the point that energy efficiency is fundamentally a question of using your energy resources in a better manner.
Thank you. Our next question.
Good afternoon. Andrew Isle. I'm an independent consultant. Thank you very much for your presentation. I completely agree that this is a topic that deserves a lot more attention from investors and policymakers. On the issue of climate change, you mentioned that the current INDC's pledges for national emissions reductions, if implemented, would take us to about a 4-degree world. But you said that there's a potential for an energy efficiency stimulus, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit. And a very brief secondary question on the issue of economic profitability of investment in energy efficiency. What sort of discount rate or cost of capital are you assuming? And I think those questions are quite related in terms of whether this energy efficiency stimulus would come from the private sector or the public sector. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that, because also that gives me the opportunity to clarify one thing that goes into detail I didn't want to mention during the presentation. What we did was in June, we actually generated what we called an INDC scenario, which worked off of the INDCs that had been submitted by that point and estimated based on the discussions that people were having, what would the INDCs look like that had yet to be submitted. So remember at that point, Brazil had not submitted, Japan had not submitted, India had not submitted. So the INDC scenario was basically a projection as to where we thought all of these INDCs would lead us to, and I think fundamentally it's consistent. What has actually happened is consistent with our projection, give or take a little. The big point I was making is the following. The fact of the matter is the INDCs, which take us through to 2030, if you were to project them, prolong them into the future, we'd end up at a world where we would not have achieved the 2 degrees. We would still be above 3 degrees. So one can hope and one expects that over time, one thing that will happen is countries will become increasingly comfortable and see the increasing need to further reduce emissions. In that regard, we believe that technology innovation as well as policy innovation will be a major driver. And in fact, this is something that we know is very much integral to the approach of the French team that's leading the negotiations. And that's why you see in the discussions around Paris, this notion of having a revisiting, a periodic revisiting every 5 years of the INDCs. A certain sense, fact of the matter is INDCs put out by countries are arguably going to naturally tend to be conservative. Countries don't want to overcommit, they prefer to undercommit. And the hope and the expectation is with time, they will become comfortable with their ability to deliver even more, and innovation will help in that regard. And we'll see an improvement in the INDCs with further constraints in terms of emissions. And to actually affect a situation where you have further constraints in terms of emissions, the 2 key areas are you clean up your energy mix, and the second is you take further action to, and I want to stress this, decouple energy growth, poverty alleviation, improved prosperity from energy demand, and energy efficiency is key to that. And that's why we believe that over time, what you will see is increasing policies and other actions to support energy efficiency investments.
Just a quick follow-up on the INDCs. I don't know if you've had a time to do any kind of deeper dive into this. I'm sure you've been very busy just finishing this report. But have you had a chance to look at some of the specifics of them? I know that India included an energy, efficiency goal as part of their INDC. Are there countries that are, did you see that potential energy efficiency gains playing a big role in country INDCs from important countries? And are there any countries that were sort of standouts in recognizing the potential benefits there?
So at the IEA, we work with something called the CCXG, together with the OECD Climate Change Expert Group, and we have a publication that should be available on the web that basically provides a quick summary, a quick inventory of all of the INDCs. So that I refer you to that document. In fact, in my bag, I have the Indian INDC, the Indonesian one, and the Brazilian one. And in my office, I have the Chinese one, and I've told all my staff that they need to read the Chinese one. I think basically what you see is, my own sense is, you don't necessarily see that many explicit references to energy efficiency. You see them in a variety of the INDCs, but it doesn't take as dominant a role of maybe I, as an energy efficiency expert, would have liked to have seen. But I also deal with climate change, and I think fundamentally the fact of the matter is you see emissions pathways that basically can only be achieved through energy efficiency. And what we do know is that these emission pathways were the result of careful modeling, and we know that in the modeling there's a lot of energy efficiency. If I could just spend a couple of minutes on the Chinese INDC, because it was reflected in some ways in the graph I showed in terms of, forget climate change just for a second, just in terms of the amount of energy consumption that China currently has as compared to where they would be if they didn't improve their energy intensity issues. It's very striking to read in the Chinese INDC this notion of the new economy, a new way, fundamentally talking about really restructuring the economy. The Indian one, it's clear too that, as India says, India is poor, India doesn't consume a lot, India doesn't emit a lot, India needs to become a lot less poor, India needs to have the opportunity to do that. Energy efficiency is a way of enabling India to do that, not only consistent with greenhouse gas emissions, but also providing a variety of other issues. Air pollution is a major concern in India as well.
And our next question.
Hello, I'm Lori Kerr, Director for Policy for the Urban Green Council, working a lot on energy efficiency policies here in the city of New York. And, cities are being seen as a driver of a lot of creative policies these days. And so I'm wondering if you could comment on your thinking about the roles cities might play in energy efficiency, particularly given the dominance of buildings within cities.
Yes. Was kind of my short answer. Yes, I agree totally. In fact, in our market reports, every year we cover different countries. And this year we decided to cover cities because we recognize that cities are major players, major catalysts, major motivators of energy efficiency investment. And so that's why you'll see in this year's report as compared to last year's report, there's actually a discussion about cities. We have a chapter on Tokyo, we have a chapter on Seoul. Paris is doing a lot. Paris is very, very concerned about the phenomenon, and often I misstate this, but the island heat phenomenon that you see in urban centers, where basically the temperature in urban centers is 2 centigrade, 5, 6, 7 degrees hotter than it is in outside areas. And fundamentally a recognition that to deal with that issue, you have to look at urban design, and a lot of those urban design issues produce more efficient results. In Paris, they're really trying to reduce the ability of people to drive their cars in. They're trying to encourage them to shift to transport. That fundamentally is a shift to a more efficient mode. Tokyo has some very interesting examples in terms of trying to promote the co-development of transport and living and work situations. So please take a look in the document. You'll see some of the discussions, and I think it's one area where clearly in the context of COP, as we're talking about non-state actors, cities have a major, major role to play in energy efficiency. If I can make one final comment, something that we see that's interesting in terms of cities is a lot of the time the discussion is not around energy savings. It's really around a variety of the other benefits that energy efficiency can provide, changing congestion patterns, but also a variety of health patterns, even including indoor air pollution issues and things like that.
Thank you. We will take one final question.
Hi, Scott Jorleen, environmental sciences and policy student. You mentioned a synergy between the solar industry and and energy efficiency. From my experience on the ground, the solar companies are largely getting the people, the consumers, who are using the most energy. So when people take energy efficiency initiatives to lower their electricity bill, there's less of an incentive from the consumer perspective. Just wondering if you could comment on that and maybe what the IEA has been doing in terms of economic modeling to take that into account.
Yeah, I think basically, thanks for that question, the basic point that I was trying to make is a lot of times the discussions around solar and the like, we're talking about the decentralized generation, and then people are talking about net zero buildings, and people are talking about auto supply, and then people talk about areas that are off-grid and the like. The fundamental point I was trying to make is that there are significant potential synergies between going to these off-grid systems and energy efficiency, where if you bundle the two together, you can actually end up truly with a self-sufficient type of building. What that will require is obviously, to a certain extent, more coordination, cooperation between renewables providers and providers of energy efficiency services, some change in the business model. And let's be clear, I think this is where fundamentally governments, cities, and others can play an important role to put in place policy environments that encourage these companies to work better together.
Thank you very much for the questions from our audience. Philippe, I don't know if you have any final thoughts or messages that you want to leave us with, or anything in particular. If we're going to read one part of the report, do we just go to the executive summary? Is there a figure that you're particularly proud of in there? Is there?
Well, what I would say is really, in some ways, do read the report, do download the report. There's some interesting information in there. But I think what's almost more important is the fact that the report exists. The fact that we need to get to the point where people instinctively understand that energy efficiency is important, that energy efficiency, and I say this sitting here in New York on Wall Street, that for many people who don't maybe care so much about climate issues or other issues, fact of the matter is a lot of energy efficiency is about money, spending money, and making money, that there's a real market out there. So the one thought I want to leave you all with that's reflected in the energy efficiency market report is that this is fundamentally a pro-business activity. And having said that, the hidden message is that if we can get businesses and households and everybody to spend a lot more on energy efficiency, we will, just happen to help ourselves on the climate change goal.
All right, thank you, and I second the call for everyone to download and read the report. I spent the last couple days going through it, and it is just a wealth of useful information. I'm looking to Ka now to see if maybe we can put a link to the report on our website if we have not already. To that, you
should also follow us on Twitter, because
we just tweeted the link as well right now, the @ColumbiaU Energy on Twitter. And again, thank you very much, Philippe Benoit from the International Energy Agency, for the fantastic presentation on the Energy Efficiency Market Report. And you can follow all the center's events at the energypolicy.columbia.edu. Again, upcoming, for your information, October 20th is MIT's Future of Solar Energy Study. October 23rd, we'll have the co-authors of IEA's 2015 Renewable Energy Market Report. And on October 26th, we'll have the conversation with Jim Rogers, former CEO of Duke Energy, on his book, Lighting the World. Thank you very much for everyone for attending, and thank you everyone who has tuned in to the live stream and the eventual podcast, and we will see you at our next event. Getting data, finding data. I've been trying to